today. I've entitled this Cynicism because what we see in the work of George Bernard Shaw is a suddenly cynical attitude, one injected into a circumstance where you might have thought, actually, civilization was at a kind of high point. The 19th century had been a century of uneven progress, but nevertheless dramatic progress, affecting the way large numbers of people lived, making them much more affluent, they're much healthier, in general, making their lives far better than they had been a century before. So, why was Shaw suddenly injecting a note of cynicism here? Already by the middle of the 19th century, there were voices, Matthew Arnold, a good example, where there was a sense that this age of faith, that this age of progress, was resting on an uneasy intellectual foundation, where people felt as if somehow this sense of purpose that others seemed to have, they didn't quite share. But those were small glimmerings. In the work of Nietzsche and some other people at the end of the century, they became louder. Shaw was one of the first people to put them in a popular form. He was a highly successful playwright, and so this enabled some of these ideas to get out to a much broader public. Now, still, it wasn't until the First World War that they became commonplace. Shaw was very much an avant-garde thinker for the time, but he was putting these ideas out in a format that they could be understood by many, many other people. Shaw himself saw a political purpose to much of what he was doing. He was a committed socialist from an early age, and so that was partly something that drives his plays. You can often see them, or see hidden in them anyway, an argument for socialism. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1925, and his plays were immensely popular. He wasn't one of those people who was just read by other literary types. He was somebody who communicated well with a mass audience. He won an Oscar for Pygmalion, and then that later got made into a famous Oscar-winning movie. Called what? My Fair Lady. Okay? Now, he was one of the co-founders of the Fabian Society in Britain. That was a socialist society founded in 1884 to advance socialism gradually. The idea was really in counterpoint to Marx, you might say, who demanded socialism by way of revolution. This was a way of saying, no, socialism should be attained gradually, bit by bit. So it did have a number of, yeah.
So was he a fan of Marx and his philosophy?
Was he a fan of Marx?
That you know of?
Yes and no. I think he thought that Marx had a vision for society that was a basically good vision, but that his idea of the means to get there was completely incorrect. And not only because Shaw thought it was unlikely that the proletarians were ever going to decide to throw off their chains and engage in the revolution, but he did not think it would be a good thing if they did. So Shaw is somebody who thought, look, there's an ideal here, an ideal of everyone committed to the good of the society as a whole, an idea of shared responsibilities but also shared benefits that he found a very appealing ideal. But he thought that Marx had it wrong about how that ideal could be achieved and ought to be achieved. So he has something in common with Marx, but I don't think he would have considered himself a Marxist in any way. Still, there is something about that vision that he shares with Marx. Yeah?
What's the significance of the wolf in sheep's clothing?
Okay, good. That's the idea of the gradualism, okay? The wolf in sheep's clothing. That was the symbol of the Fabian Society. The wolf was socialism. The sheep's clothing was the gradual introduction. Oh, we're not in favor of the socialist revolution, but don't you think there should be a limit on working conditions, and we should have a minimum wage, and this type of thing, and so on. And the idea was to sort of plan over a century the gradual introduction of socialist reforms. So Shaw was only one of the famous members of this group. H.G. Wells, the author of The Time Machine, for example, was another. Havelock Ellis, Virginia Woolf, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, and a variety of other people who played important roles in British politics were members of this society. Eventually, that society founded the Labour Party, which still persists in Britain. So this is, to some extent, the intellectual heritage of the Labour Party. Here is an image that shows you something else about the Fabian Society. This is a stained glass window that is meant to reflect the Fabians' ideals. And what's going on in that stained glass window? What are people doing? Well, some are metalworking. Yes, they're forging some. Notice the people there on the right. What are they doing? They've got hammers. They're smashing the globe. Okay? They are destroying the world as it exists now. But not to worry, there on the left, they're forging a new world. And so doing metalworking of replacing the world that exists, which is going to be destroyed, with another world. And what's happening down here at the bottom? You've got a bunch of people praying, and what are they praying to? You actually have to look really carefully to see this. In fact, I have to blow it up a lot. Oh, it's very hard.
Not that cheap.
Yeah, Minority Report on the Poor Law, Industrial Democracy, the history of trade unionism, the English social contract, in short, a bunch of things that are part of the political heritage of the Fabian Society. Now, there we go. What is socialism? It's been defined in all sorts of ways. A very common definition is to say it's the abolition of private property. I don't love that definition myself, partly because it really makes socialism and communism essentially the same thing, and I don't think they are, but also because it ties this to a specific kind of social institution and removes it from, I think, a really important distinguishing feature of socialism. I think a much better definition was actually framed by Friedrich Hayek. We'll read him later in the course. He is one of the most famous enemies of socialism, but for or against, it seems to me he does give you a very nice general definition of the term. He says socialism is the centralized, conscious direction of social forces to consciously chosen ends. So the idea here is that you've got certain decisions being made for society in a centralized way, and then social forces, economic forces, yes, having to do with private property, but things more generally, are being directed from the center toward consciously chosen ends. Now, the reason I mention that that is, I think, a better definition is not only that it frees it from specific social constraints, but it makes this idea of conscious choice central to socialism. In fact, Whittaker Chambers at one point was trying to describe his own attraction to communism in his younger days, and he said, here was the attraction. It promised a rational world where our means were chosen rationally, toward ends that were chosen rationally. And so that, I think, is this idea that's being captured by Hayek here. It's the idea of consciously choosing your goals, consciously choosing your means to those goals, and doing that in a centralized and organized way. So here's a little picture, you might say, that represents that. The little star there is the ends. They're consciously chosen, so society gets together and chooses ends, okay, comprehensively, and then decides to direct social forces toward achieving those ends, and those decisions and the direction ultimately come from something centralized. Even if the decisions are democratic, and a democratic form of socialism would say, look, the people get to choose the ends, the people get to choose the means. But nevertheless, at some point, there has to be an actual direction of social forces toward those consciously chosen ends. Now, what's the contrast to this? You might think, well, gosh, choosing my ends, choosing my means, all that sounds good, right? How could anybody disagree with that? It's really meant to be contrasted with a sort of free enterprise system where things go in this way. If socialism involves the centralized direction of social forces, a free enterprise system based on liberty is decentralized. You pursue your ends, I pursue my ends. We don't have to get together and agree on what our ends are. We just do our own thing. Conscious? Well, in socialism, it's to be a conscious choice of means and ends. We're consciously to direct social forces, but on the other side, things are just market-driven. Nobody, you might say, consciously chooses how many apples to produce in the society at large. This apple grower produces that many, this apple grower produces that many, these people buy that many apples. There's nobody who's consciously directing apple production. Well, direction of social forces, that's part of the socialism idea. But on the liberty side, it's really a question of the evolution of social forces. In fact, in some ways, this political division mirrors the creationism versus evolution division in biology, because the socialist essentially says, yes, we've got to make conscious choices about these things. We consciously choose our ends. We consciously choose the means to them. We direct social forces throughout the society to achieve those social ends. The person on the other side says, look, society can evolve as it likes. People will solve certain problems as they arise for those people, and it will take the shape that it evolves to have. There's no conscious, centralized attempt to make it take a certain shape. And finally then, are the ends consciously chosen? Well, in socialism, yes. People together choose their ends, whereas in the other framework, people are just making their own free choices about their individual ends. So on the one side, we've got people agreeing together, these are the ends we will work toward as a society. On the other side, people work toward whatever ends they choose to pursue, and the society and its ends and its achievement of those ends just depends on, well, the market-driven interaction among people pursuing their own individual ends. So there are two very different visions of how a society ought to be organized. It's not just a question of property, it's a question of having a centralized direction, having direction of social forces at all, making collective choices about our goals together, as opposed to just having individual people pursue their own goals. Now, that's really just background for understanding some of what drives Shaw. He did change later in life, not that he became more attracted to the free market idea, but he just became more cynical about both. He thought that people making individual decisions were bound to be selfish and not very helpful to society at large. But the more time went on, he became cynical. Well, as we'll see, in 1903, he was already really cynical. But he becomes even more cynical about leaders, about people making political choices. And he says, you know what, if people are terrible in making individual choices, actually they're pretty terrible at making collective choices too. And so he becomes pessimist. He says, every people has the government it deserves. It's more to the point that every government has the electorate it deserves. The orators of the front bench can edify or debauch an ignorant electorate at will. Thus our democracy moves in a vicious circle of reciprocal worthiness and unworthiness. So good leaders tend to edify the people, bad leaders debase the people, debauch the people. The people then in turn choose even worse leaders, who then lead the people even more astray, etc., etc. And so he became cynical about the possibility of politics to solve any human problems at all. In a play called Back to Methuselah, 1921, the serpent appears to Adam and Eve, well, I guess here to Eve in the garden, and says, you see things and you say, wow, but I dream things that never were, and say, why not? You might recognize that phrase. That became actually one of the symbolic statements of Robert Kennedy's drive for the presidency. But actually here it's Satan saying this, right? It's the serpent in the garden saying this. And Shaw was cynical about not just people's individual choices, but by this later stage, after the war, he was cynical about political leaders. He was cynical about what people would decide together. He began to see that, in a sense, this idea that politics solves human problems is really a snare and a delusion. That in the end it's a dream that is an immensely attractive dream, but he began to think politics in whatever form ends up failing. Well, in his final play, you can see this cynicism playing out. Why appeal to the mob when 95% of them don't understand politics? They do nothing but mischief without leaders. And what sort of leaders do they vote for? Titus Oates and Lord George Gordon with their popish plots, for Hitlers who call on them to exterminate Jews, for Mussolinis who rallied them to nationalist dreams of glory, an empire in which all foreigners are enemies to be subjugated. Now, notice here, he's bashing people on right and left. He's attacking all sorts of people, and he's generally, by this point, hostile to democracy. He ends up saying, look, people are bad at making political choices. They get leaders who are terrible leaders. Those terrible leaders make them even worse at making political choices. And so he became quite generally cynical. Well, we're going to talk today primarily about an earlier work of his, Maxims for Revolutionists, an appendix to the play Man and Superman, which he published in 1903. Now let's talk a little bit about the play, Man and Superman. That's a reference to Nietzsche. And indeed, Shaw, at this stage, is thinking of himself as partly putting Nietzsche's ideas out there before the broader public. In Nietzsche, well, there's this idea, especially late in Nietzsche's life, that man is really an evolutionary animal and is in the process of evolving towards something higher than man is now. So human beings have evolved from the apes, let's say, and are going to evolve into something else. He calls that the Übermensch, the Superman, okay? However, he thinks there are stages in that evolution, and one of the stages is what he refers to as the last man, a sort of pathetic figure. And to some extent, what's happening in the play is that we see this, this drive of man to be replaced with something higher. We see some of the features of what Nietzsche calls the last man. And we also see a huge part of the play actually has to do with gender relations, with men and women and the way in which men and women relate. And you can see a lot of the cynicism there. But in any event, the idea here is based on Nietzsche's thought that we are evolving away from morality toward a state where we are beyond good and evil. Indeed, Nietzsche wrote an entire work called Beyond Good and Evil. And that is in part what Shaw sees happening here. So what does he do in this little appendix called Maxims for Revolutionists? This is supposed to be the pamphlet that the character in the play, who is a young socialist revolutionary, has produced. He makes fun of a lot of traditional morality, specifically Christian morality, though as we'll see, it extends far broader than that. So, here we've got the golden rule. If there was one thing, you might say, that's central to Christian morality, it might be the golden rule. Do unto others what you would have them do unto you. Or Immanuel Kant puts this in a highly sophisticated form in the categorical imperative, which actually says, act only on the maxim you can at the same time will to be a universal law. But a simple way of putting it would be just, don't make an exception for yourself. Whatever principles you're operating by and applying to others, apply to yourself too. So don't do to them what you wouldn't want done to yourself. Do act toward them the way you would want them to act toward you. Treat others, in other words, with the dignity and respect that you'd like to be treated. Here is Shaw's response. Do to others what you'd have them do to you. Shaw says, do not do unto others as you would have them do to you. Their tastes may not be the same. Now notice the underlying relativism there. That's something Shaw picks up from Nietzsche. But notice also the criticism. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, wait a minute. People might vary in the way they'd like to be treated. How would you like to be treated? Let's say you walk into a party where you don't know anyone. You're new to a given place. You're walking in, it's kind of socially awkward. What would you like somebody else to do?
Introduce themselves.
Oh, introduce themselves to you. So maybe you should introduce yourself to others. Now, can you imagine anybody else having a different set of preferences? Like what?
Well, an introvert wouldn't want anyone to talk to them. They just want to branch off.
Okay, good. Suppose you're really shy. Then maybe you don't want any strangers to come up and talk to you. So the golden rule might imply, so you shouldn't talk to them. Of course, you might think, well, gosh, we could really make this more general. I would want other people to respect my wishes about being talked to or not talked to. So I should respect their wishes. But now, how do I know? I'm wandering around this room of people I don't know. Who wants me to introduce myself and who doesn't? I don't know. So now I don't know what to do. So in short, Shaw is saying, wait a minute, this might vary from person to person. Of course, he's more cynical than that. He thinks, some people might have desires that are very different from those. So somebody else might want somebody at the party to come over and seduce them, right? And so he's thinking, I'd love to be seduced, so I guess I should go in and try to seduce others. Well, gosh, maybe not, right? So there's a worry here, Shaw says, look, if people vary enough in their taste and preference and the way they'd like to be treated, this is going to get us into real trouble. What about Jesus' summary of the law? Love your neighbor as yourself. That's something that appears throughout the Bible in a variety of places, Old Testament and New Testament. Is that a good bit of advice? Shaw says, don't love your neighbor as yourself. If you're on good terms with yourself, it's an impertinence. If on bad, an injury. So, do I want you to love me the way you love yourself? I don't know. How do you feel about yourself?
Yeah.
Right? If you love yourself, well, gosh, should you love me? You don't even know me. And what about the other side of this? What if you don't like yourself very much? That means you're not going to like me. So that's at least Shaw's response. Again, we see a sort of relativism here. Now, how good are these as critiques of traditional Christian morality? Does Shaw have a point or not? In both cases, he's saying, treat others as you would have them treat you. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. And he's trying to make fun of that. Depends on what you want. How you'd like to be treated, how you feel about yourself. Do you think that's often I've got to admit, I don't know whether Shaw is making a deep point or whether it's a silly quip. And it's actually a kind of superficial, dumb point. And so with all of these things he produces here, I think it's worth thinking hard about whether that's a serious argument or just kind of a clever quip that goes away as soon as you think about it for a few minutes. So what do you think these are? Yeah?
If this was a serious argument, don't you think this would be at odds with his socialist opinions and being more in favor of the more relative, decentralized system of liberty?
Actually, that's a really interesting point. There is a tension between the relativism that's implied here and this socialist ideal. After all, the socialist wants us to get together and choose ends for our group together, and then wants us to pursue means that we choose together and direct all of us toward that common goal. But if really in the end, each of us has very different goals, and you want to be treated in a very different way from me, then you might think, how's that ever supposed to work? How do we ever get together and agree? So I think you're right that actually it's hard to take the underlying relativism very seriously and be a socialist. How do you be a relativist and a socialist at the same time? At least if you're a relativist in this individual to individual way. Maybe if you think things are relative to the group as a whole, it would work. But thinking that you and I have very different conceptions of the good, let's put them together and choose the good together, that's going to be hard to do. Well, anyway, there are a lot of things to think about here. Here is his version of the golden rule. The golden rule is that there are no golden rules. Now, what is he doing? There is an Enlightenment idea that we've talked about, that there is such a thing as objective truth, that it's possible for us to know it, that reason is the best means for us to know the objective truth, and that by the use of reason and our knowledge of objective truths, we have the best key to human progress. Shaw is, in a way, challenging a particular application of that. Not the application to science, but a lot of Enlightenment thinkers would have said it's exactly the same in morality. There are certain objective moral truths. It is possible for us to know some of them through the use of reason. And the best way to actually lead a good life, individually and together, is for us to use reason to know those objective moral truths. Well, here, he seems to be saying, look, here's my version of the golden rule, the objective moral truth. There are no objective moral truths. And in that way, he's really directly attacking that Enlightenment ideal as applied to morality. Now, you might still apply it to mathematics. You might still apply it to science itself. You might apply it to logic. But he's suggesting that you don't apply it to morality. Most Enlightenment thinkers thought there were these objective moral truths that were universal with respect to the physical world, and there were also similar things with respect to not only individual morality, but to politics. And Shaw seems to be challenging that here, saying, what if it's not true? Actually, he thinks the only objective truth about this is that there are no objective truths about it. Now that sounds like a self-contradiction. A little bit like Socrates, who was reported by Diogenes Laertius to have said, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. There's something ridiculous about that, right? What do you know, Socrates? Only one thing, that I know nothing. But wait, that's one thing. You know that, right? So you don't know nothing. You know something. Oh yeah, wait. So anyway, there's wait, then if this is objective, but I think Shaw here can say, look, it's not actually a contradiction in that way. Why? Because the golden rule is that there are no golden rules. That itself, he's calling it a golden rule, but it's not really, I think, as he thinks of it, an objective moral principle. It's something else, because it's saying there is no such thing as an objective moral principle. What about temptation? One of the traditional ethical problems that people have to face is weakness of will, akrasia in the Greek, or in other words, the problem of temptation. Ovid, the Roman poet, defined weakness of will as knowing the better and doing the worse. You know what you ought to do, but you don't do it. That happens all the time, right?
Yeah.
You know what you ought to do, and yet somehow you end up doing something else. What's an example?
Going to bed at a good time.
Good, you know you ought to get to bed at a good time. Actually, yes, some of you might have gone to the university lecture series last night. Getting enough sleep is important. You might know you want to get enough sleep, and yet you find yourself staying up later and later. In fact, I've got to say, college has changed dramatically in that respect. I was always in bed by midnight, unless I had a paper due the next morning and was panicking at the last minute. This idea of people staying up until 3 and 4 in the morning, that didn't happen in the 70s. Maybe we were too high by then. Anyway, whatever happened in the 70s. Anyway, we didn't have that problem. But today, it seems to me a lot of you stay up until 3 and 4 in the morning. And so, anyway, that's a problem. And you might know you shouldn't do that. But nevertheless, you end up doing it for other reasons. So that would be an example of weakness of will. What's another example of weakness of will? Yeah. Procrastination. You know you want to study as you go along and not wait and put off all the work until the end, but nevertheless you do it. Some people accuse me of being a procrastinator. I say, no, I just learned the lessons of Japanese manufacturing in the 80s. I call it just-in-time work. My just-in-time inventory system. I basically start the project when you remind me that it's overdue. Other things that are weakness of will. Yeah. Dieting, yes, exactly. I am on a diet right now, so I know I'm supposed to be eating only this and not that and so on. But last night my daughter says, hey, listen, a lesson got canceled. I'm here close by, I want to go to happy hour. Half-price appetizers. I say, sure. And then I get there and I think, but I'll just order something healthy. And I say, half-price chicken wings? Oh, yes, please. Weakness of will. Okay, I know what I should be doing, and in fact, my cell phone helps to remind me what I should be doing and eating and so on, and I don't do it. Now, the most famous example of this, the most famous discussion of this is in Paul's letter to the Romans, where it goes like this. He says, I don't understand what I do. What I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. For I have a desire to do what is good, but I can't carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I don't want to do, this I keep on doing. Now that is a classic statement of this problem of temptation, weakness of will. And of course we've got lots of artistic representations of this, of Eve and the serpent there in the garden. Or Adam and Eve, or that's a beautiful painting just called Temptation. Mom and baby there with the apple. I don't really understand it, but it's marvelous. Anyway, what does Shaw have to say about temptation? You might say traditional morality is, look, this is a huge problem. You've got to develop your strength of will so that you can resist temptation. And so, in the Gospels, for example, watch and pray so you won't fall into temptation. Prove all things, hold fast that which is good. Now, here's Shaw. Never resist temptation. Prove all things, hold fast that which is good. Okay? Never resist temptation. Try it out. Find out what works for you. Okay? That's a really different attitude about temptation. Like you're on a diet, you shouldn't be ordering those chicken wings. Shaw says, order the chicken wings. Find out how much you like them. Maybe you'll decide it's worth it. Well, you've never done cocaine? Come on. Okay. Now, there are some obvious dangers to this, but that seems to be the attitude. Prove all things and hold fast that which is good after trying them all. What about this? Do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Classic statement in the Sermon on the Mount of this idea of loving your enemy, okay, and of responding to injury and injustice, not with further injury, not even with a quest for justice, but with forgiveness. Here's Shaw. Beware of the man who doesn't return your blow. He neither forgives you nor allows you to forgive yourself. Then there are all sorts of stray sayings like this. If you injure your neighbor, better not do it by halves. Make sure they can't hit you back.
Yeah.
He also makes fun of all sorts of Enlightenment ideals. Christianity is the main target here, but it's not the only target. Everything else that is sort of valued under the Enlightenment comes under his attack. So, decadence can find agents only when it wears the mask of progress. A lot of people in Shaw's shoes and being interested in socialist ideals would say, yes, progress is a very important thing. but he makes fun of the idea of progress. The whole 19th century defined itself as an age of progress. But, he says, really, that's just a mask for decadence. What about reason? We've said reason. And reason is a tool to achieve objective truth and thereby progress is a fundamental thing to the Enlightenment ideal. He says the man who listens to reason is lost. Reason enslaves all whose minds are not strong enough to master it. So reason he actually sees as a great danger. Not something that's helpful, not something that's a great tool for progress and knowledge, but instead a dangerous master. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. Some of these you'll probably recognize. I've seen that one on a bumper sticker. It's long, so no one can read it unless they're walking by the car, but I've seen it in a faculty parking lot. The love of fair play is a spectator's virtue, not a principal's. So fairness, justice, come on. The people in this, who are, let's say the people on the football field don't care about fairness. So let's say you're a Longhorn fan or a Cowboy fan, and the referee makes a call in the field that is against your team. What do? Do you say, well, let's wait for the replay? I'm interested in a fair fight. I want justice. No, you boo, right? I mean, you go, boo, are you blind, etc. And why? Because you're cheering for that team. You don't care about fair play. Do you want to make sure the game between Texas and Oklahoma is fair? Between the Cowboys and the Giants is fair? I mean, you might. I'm a relatively fair-minded football fan. Enough on this. Marriage, what about that? Marriage is popular because it combines the maximum of temptation with the maximum of opportunity. That's a rather cynical view of marriage, right? Yeah.
I'm not married or anything, but like, what part of marriage is temptation?
What part of marriage is temptation? You're supposed to get married to the person you're most attracted to. Okay? And so your husband or wife is supposed to be the person you most want to be with. And marriage lets you be with them all you want. That's supposed to be the idea here. Okay? Well, anyhow. Yes, what about education? We've said that this was the era of the introduction of mass education, universal literacy, including scientific education and so on. But Shaw, again, doesn't champion this. He says, when a man teaches something he doesn't know to somebody else who has no aptitude for it and gives them a certificate of proficiency, the latter is completed, the education of its symbol. Notice he insults everybody there, right? The teacher, somebody who teaches what they don't know, to somebody else, the student, somebody who has no aptitude for it. Then the teacher gives that student a certificate of proficiency. That's education. A fool's brain digests philosophy into folly, science into superstition, and art into pedantry. Hence, university education. All right, he is so pessimistic, right? Here's another. He who can does, he who cannot teaches. There's a Woody Allen movie where he extends this. He who can't teaches Jim. But yeah, I mean, you go and think, look, if you know so much, why aren't you out there making millions in the world? Why are you just in a class teaching finance instead of actually doing finance, etc.? A learned man is an idler who kills time with study. Beware his false knowledge, it's more dangerous than ignorance. No man can be a pure specialist without being, in the strict sense, an idiot. So clearly he doesn't have respect for universities, for students, for professors, for researchers, for anything. Exactly right. Activity, he says, is the only road to knowledge. Every fool believes what his teachers tell him and calls his credulity science or morality as confidently as his father called it divine revelation. What about liberty? What about equality? He says, you confuse for political liberty with freedom and political equality with similarity. He's never thought for 5 minutes about either. Nothing can be unconditional, consequently nothing can be free. Liberty means responsibility. That's why most men dread it. Where equality is undisputed, so also is subordination. So notice here, he's actually attacking, even in 1903, both sides of that contrast I set up. The socialist conscious direction of social forces side, and the liberty, let things evolve according to people's free choices side. He's basically saying, a pox on both their houses. Liberty, it's a bunch of nonsense. But equality, that's the thing that's driving a lot of the stuff on the other side, that's nonsense too. Property, said Proudhon, is theft. That's the only perfect truism that's ever been uttered on this subject. What about government? Just the organization of idolatry, a bunch of functionaries. Democracy? Yes, well, it substitutes election by the incompetent many for appointment by the corrupt few. Civilization is a disease produced by the practice of building societies with rotten material. And now, there are two of these statements that I think are really somewhat shocking. The first in a bad way, and the second in a kind of good way, because it seems to me a deep insight. So the first, the really shocking one, in a bad way. The imagination cannot conceive a viler criminal than he who should build another London like the present one, nor a greater benefactor than he who should destroy it. Now that's pretty shocking. This is London in 1903. It was considered the most civilized, the most advanced city in the world. He is willing to throw it all away, destroy it all, even though it was really a high point of civilization, at least since ancient Rome. That's the London he's happy to have destroyed. Well, he would get his wish. He just had to wait a few years. But we'll come to that later. Here is the part that I think is really interesting and insightful. You can't believe in honor until you've achieved it. But here's the good part. Better keep yourself clean and bright. You are the window through which you see the world. You are the window through which you must see the world. That seems to me actually a really interesting observation. In art, there is a very common theme of people at windows, and this idea that you are the window through which you observe the world, and that your character is something reflected thereby in what you see around you. That seems to me a very important insight. So we can look at lots of these artworks of people in windows that are meant to make, I think, a similar point. But also, it reminds me of something we're going to look at later. British philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch sounds a very similar thing. She says we spend most of our lives in a kind of inner dialogue with ourselves. It matters hugely what kind of dialogue it is. It determines at least as much as anything external to us. Anything external that happens to us, what kind of life we lead. And so she ends up saying every moment has a moral tag, determined by the character of that dialogue. I think that, in a way, is Shaw's insight. And so a lot of things are going on in the world, but a huge amount of the way you see the world depends on you.